More About Paddington by Michael Bond. Chapter 4. Paddington and the Bonfire. Soon after the Marrow adventure, the weather changed. It began to get colder. The leaves fell from the trees, and it became dark very early in the evenings. Jonathan and Judy went back to school, and Paddington was left on his own for much of the day. But one morning, towards the end of October, a letter arrived with his name on the envelope. It was marked urgent and strictly personal, and it was in Jonathan's writing. Paddington didn't get many letters, only an occasional picture postcard from his Aunt Lucy in Peru, so it was all the more exciting. In some ways, it was a rather mysterious letter, and Paddington couldn't make head nor tail of it. In it, Jonathan asked him to collect all the dry leaves he could find and sweep them into a pile ready for when he came home in a few days' time. Paddington puzzled about it for a long time, and in the end he decided to consult his friend Mr. Gruber on the subject. Mr. Gruber knew about most things, and even if he couldn't tell the answer to a question right away, he had a huge library of books in his antique shop, and he knew just where to look. He and Paddington often had a long chat about things in general over their morning cocoa, and Mr. Gruber liked nothing better than to help Paddington with his problems.
"A problem shared is a problem halved, Mr. Brown," he was fond of saying, "and I must say that since you came to live in the district, I've never been short of things to look up."
As soon as he'd finished his breakfast, Paddington put on his scarf and duffel coat, collected the morning shopping list from Mrs. Bird, and set off with his basket on wheels towards the shops in the Portobello Road. Paddington enjoyed shopping. He was a popular bear with the street traders in the market, even though he usually struck a hard bargain. He always compared the prices on the various stalls very carefully before actually buying anything. Mrs. Bird said he made the housekeeping money go twice as far as anyone else. It was even colder outside than Paddington had expected, and when he stopped to look in a newsagent's on the way, his breath made the bottom of the window quite cloudy. Paddington was a polite bear, and when he saw the shopkeeper glaring at him through the door, he carefully rubbed the steamy part with his paw in case anyone else wanted to look in. As he did so, he suddenly noticed that the inside of the window had changed since he'd last passed that way. Before, it had been full of chocolate and sweets. Now they were all gone, and in their place was a very ragged-looking dummy sitting on top of a pile of logs. It held a notice in its hand which said, "Remember, remember, the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason and plot." And underneath that was an even larger notice saying, "Get your fireworks here." Paddington studied it all very carefully for a few moments, and then hurried on to Mr. Gruber's, pausing only to pick up his morning supply of buns at the bakery, where he had a standing order. Now that the cold weather had set in, Mr. Gruber no longer sat on the pavement in front of his shop in the morning. Instead, he had arranged a sofa by the stove in the back of the shop. It was a cosy corner, surrounded by books, but Paddington didn't quite like it as much as being outside. For one thing, the sofa was an old one, and some of the horsehairs poked through. But he quickly forgot about this as he handed Mr. Gruber his share of buns and began telling him of the morning's happenings.
"Gunpowder, treason and plot,"
said Mr. Gruber, as he handed Paddington a large mug of steaming cocoa.
"Why, that's to do with Guy Fawkes Day."
He smiled apologetically and rubbed the steam from his glasses when he saw that Paddington still looked puzzled.
"I always forget, Mr. Brown," he said, "that you come from Darkest Peru. I don't suppose you know about Guy Fawkes."
Paddington wiped the cocoa from his whiskers with the back of his paw in case it left a stain, and he shook his head.
"Well," continued Mr. Gruber, "I expect you've seen fireworks before. I seem to remember when I was in South America many years ago, they always had them on fete days."
Paddington nodded. Now that Mr. Gruber mentioned it, he did remember his Aunt Lucy taking him to a firework display. Although he'd only been very small at the time, he had enjoyed it very, very much.
We only have fireworks once a year here," said Mr. Gruber, "on November the 5th.
And then he went on to tell Paddington all about the plot to blow up the Houses of Parliament many years ago, and how its discovery at the last moment had been celebrated ever since by the burning of bonfires and letting off of fireworks. Mr. Gruber was very good at explaining things, and Paddington thanked him when he'd finished. Mr. Gruber sighed, and a faraway look came into his eyes.
"It's been a long time since I had any fireworks of my own, Mr. Brown," he said. "A very long time indeed."
Well, Mr. Gruber," said Paddington importantly, "I think we're going to have a display. You must come to ours." Mr. Gruber looked so pleased at being invited that Paddington hurried off at once to finish his shopping. He was anxious to get back to the newsagents quickly so he could investigate the fireworks properly. When he entered the shop, the man looked at him doubtfully over the top of the counter.
"Fireworks," he said. "I'm not sure I'm supposed to serve young bears with fireworks."
Paddington gave him a hard stare. "In Darkest Peru," he said, remembering all that Mr. Gruber had told him, "we had fireworks every fete day."
"I dare say," said the man. "But this isn't Darkest Peru, nor nothing like it. What do you want, bangers or the other sort?"
"I think I'd like to try some you can hold in the paw for a start," said Paddington. The man hesitated.
"All right," he said. "I'll let you have a packet of best sparklers, but if you singe your whiskers, don't come running to me, grumbling and wanting your money back."
Paddington promised he would be very careful and was soon hurrying back up the road towards the Browns' house. As he rounded the last corner, he bumped into a small boy wheeling a pram. The boy held out a cap containing several coppers and touched his hat respectfully. "Penny for the guy, sir." "Thank you very much," said Paddington, taking a penny out of the cap. "It's very kind of you."
"Oi!"
said the boy, as Paddington turned to go.
"Oi! You're supposed to give me a penny, not take one yourself."
Paddington stared at him. "Give you a penny?" he said, hardly able to believe his ears. "What for?"
"For the guy, of course," said the boy. "That's what I said, a penny for the guy."
He pointed to the pram, and Paddington noticed for the first time that there was a figure inside it. It was dressed in an old suit and wearing a mask. It looked just like the one he'd seen in the shop window earlier that morning. Paddington was so surprised that he'd undone his suitcase and placed a penny in the boy's hat before he really knew what he was doing.
"If you don't like giving penny for the guy,"
said the small boy as he turned to go,
"why don't you get one of your own? All you need is an old suit and a bit of straw."
Paddington was very thoughtful as he made his way home. He even almost forgot to ask for a second helping at lunch. "I do hope he hasn't hit on another of his ideas," said Mrs. Brown, as Paddington asked to be excused and disappeared into the garden. "It's most unlike him to have to be reminded about things like that, especially when it's stew. He's usually so fond of dumplings."
"I expect it's an idea," said Mrs. Bird ominously. "I know the signs."
"Well, I expect the fresh air will do him good," said Mrs. Brown, looking out of the window. "And it's very good of him to offer to sweep up all the leaves. The garden's in such a mess."
"It's November," said Mrs. Bird. "Guy Fawkes."
"Oh," said Mrs. Brown. "Oh dear." For the next hour, Paddington enjoyed himself in the garden with Mrs. Bird's dustpan and brush. The Browns had a number of trees, and very soon he had a large pile of leaves, almost twice his own height, in the middle of the cabbage patch. It was while he was sitting down for a rest in the middle of the flower bed that he felt someone watching him. He looked up to see Mr. Curry, the Brown's next-door neighbour, eyeing him suspiciously over the fence. Mr. Curry wasn't very fond of bears, and he was always trying to catch Paddington doing something he shouldn't, so that he could go and report him. He had a reputation in the neighbourhood for being mean and disagreeable, and the Browns had as little to do with him as possible.
"What you doing, bear?"
he growled at Paddington.
I hope you're not thinking of setting light to all those leaves.
Oh, no, said Paddington. It's for Guy Fawkes.
Fireworks, said Mr. Curry grumpily. Nasty things, banging away and frightening people.
Paddington, who had been toying with the idea of trying out one of his sparklers, hastily hid the packet behind his back. Aren't you having any fireworks then, Mr. Curry? He asked politely.
Fireworks?
Mr. Curry looked at Paddington with distaste.
Me? I can't afford them, Bear. Waste of money. And what's more, if I get any coming over in my garden, I shall report the whole matter to the police.
Paddington felt very glad he hadn't tested his sparkler.
Mind you, Bear.
A sly gleam came into Mr. Curry's eye, and he looked around carefully to make sure no one else was listening.
If anyone else likes to invite me to their firework display, that's a different matter.
He signalled Paddington over to the fence and began whispering in his ear. As Paddington listened, his face got longer and longer, and his whiskers began to sag.
I think it's disgraceful,
said Mrs. Bird later on that day, when she heard that Mr. Curry had invited himself to the firework party.
Frightening a young bear like that with talk of police and such like, just because he's too mean to bear his own fireworks. It's a good job he didn't say that to me. I'd have told him a thing or two.
Oh, poor Paddington, said Mrs. Brown. He looked most upset. Where is he now?
I don't know, said Mrs. Bird. He's gone off somewhere looking for some straw. I expect it's to do with bonfire.
She returned to the subject of Mr. Curry.
When I think of all the errands that young bear's run for him, wearing his paws to the bone, just because he's too lazy to go himself.
He does like to take advantage of people, said Mrs. Brown. Why, he even left his old suit on the porch this morning to be collected by our laundry for cleaning.
Did he? Exclaimed Mrs. Bird grimly. Well, we'll soon see about that.
She hurried out to the front door and then called out to Mrs. Brown.
You did say the porch?
That's right, replied Mrs. Brown. In the corner.
It's not there now,
called Mrs. Bird.
Someone must have taken it away.
That's very strange, said Mrs. Brown. I didn't hear anyone knock, and the laundryman hasn't been yet. How very odd.
It'll serve him right, said Mrs. Bird, as she returned to the kitchen. If someone's taken it, that'll teach him a lesson.
In spite of her stern appearance, Mrs. Bird was a kindly soul at heart, but she became very cross when people took advantage of others, especially Paddington. Oh, well, said Mrs. Brown. I expect it'll sort itself out. I must try to remember to ask Paddington if he's seen it when he comes in. As it happened, Paddington was gone for quite a long time, so that when he did finally return, Mrs. Brown had forgotten all about the matter. It had been dark for some time when he let himself into the garden by the back way. He pushed his basket up the path until he reached Mr. Brown's shed, and then, after a struggle, managed to lift a large object out of the basket and place it in a corner behind the lawn-mower. There was also a small cardboard box marked Guy Fawkes, which rattled when he shook it. Paddington shut the door of the shed, carefully hid the cardboard box underneath his hat in the bottom of the basket, and then crept quietly out of the garden and round to the front door. He felt pleased with himself. It had been a very good evening's work indeed, much better than he'd expected, and that night, before he went to sleep, he spent a long time writing a letter to Jonathan in which he told him all about it. "Gosh, Paddington!" exclaimed Jonathan several days later, when they were getting ready for the display. "What a super lot of fireworks!" He peered into the cardboard box, which was almost full to the brim. "I've never seen so many." "Honestly, Paddington," said Judy admiringly, "anyone would think you'd been collecting in the street or something." Paddington waved a paw vaguely through the air and exchanged a knowing glance with Jonathan. But before he had time to explain things to Judy, Mr. Brown entered the room. He was dressed in an overcoat and gumboots, and he was carrying a lighted candle. "Right," he said. "Are we all ready?" "Mr. Gruber's waiting in the hall, and Mrs. Bird's got the chairs all ready on the veranda." Mr. Brown looked as eager as anyone to start the firework display, and he eyed Paddington's box enviously. I vote, he said, holding up his hand for silence when they were all outside in the garden, that as this is Paddington's first November the 5th, we let him set off the first firework.
Hear, hear, applauded Mr. Gruber. What sort would you like, Mr. Brown?
Paddington looked thoughtfully at the box. There were so many different shapes and sizes, it was difficult to decide.
I think I'll have one of those you can hold in the paw first, he said. I think I'll have a sparkler.
Dull things, sparklers,
said Mr. Curry, who was sitting in the best chair, helping himself to some marmalade sandwiches.
If Paddington wants a sparkler, he shall have one,
said Mrs. Bird, giving Mr. Curry a freezing look. Mr. Brown handed Paddington the candle, taking care not to let the hot wax drip onto his fur, and there was a round of applause as the sparkler burst into life. Paddington waved it over his head several times, and there was another sound of applause as he moved it up and down to spell out the letters Paddingtun.
Very effective,
said Mr. Gruber.
But that's not how you spell Paddington,
grumbled Mr. Curry, his mouth full of sandwich.
It's how I spell it,
said Paddington. He gave Mr. Curry one of his special hard stares, but unfortunately it was dark, and so the full effect was lost. How about lighting the bonfire? Said Mr. Brown hurriedly. Then we can all see what we're doing. There was a crackle from the dried leaves as he bent down to apply the match.
That's better,
said Mr. Curry, rubbing his hands together.
I find it rather draughty on this veranda of yours. I think I'll let off a few more fireworks if there's no more sandwiches left.
He looked across at Mrs. Bird.
There aren't, said Mrs. Bird. You've just had the last one. Honestly,
she continued, as Mr. Curry moved away and began rummaging in Paddington's box.
The cheek of some people, and he never even brought so much as a Catherine wheel himself.
He does spoil things, said Mrs. Brown. Everyone's been looking forward to this evening. Have a good mind. Whatever Mrs. Brown had been about to say was lost as there came a cry from the direction of the garden shed. Crikey, Paddington! Shouted Jonathan. Why ever didn't you tell us? Tell us what? Asked Mr. Brown, trying to divide his attention between a Roman candle which had just fizzled out and the mysterious object which Jonathan was dragging from the shed. It's a guy! Shouted Judy with delight. And a super one too! Exclaimed Jonathan. It looks just like a real person. Is it yours, Paddington?
Well, said Paddington, yes and no.
He looked rather worried. In the excitement, he'd quite forgotten about the guy which he'd used when he collected the money for the fireworks. He wasn't at all sure he wanted the others to know about it in case too many questions were asked.
A guy? Said Mr. Curry. Then it had better go on the bonfire.
He peered at it through the smoke. For some odd reason there was a familiar look about it which he couldn't quite place.
Oh, no, said Paddington hurriedly. I don't think you'd better do that. It's not really for burning.
Nonsense, Bear, said Mr. Curry. I can see you don't know much about Guy Fawkes Night. Guys are always burned.
He pushed the others to one side, and with the help of Mr. Brown's garden rake, placed the guy on top of the bonfire.
There,
he exclaimed, as he stood back rubbing his hands.
That's better. That's what I call a bonfire.
Mr. Brown removed his glasses, polished them, and then looked hard at the bonfire. He didn't recognise the suit the guy was wearing, and he was glad to see it wasn't one of his. All the same, he had a nasty feeling at the back of his mind.
It seems a very, very well-dressed sort of guy, he remarked.
Mr. Curry started, and then stepped forward to take a closer look. Now that the bonfire was well and truly alight, it was easier to see. The trousers were blazing merrily, and the jacket had just started to smoulder. His eyes nearly popped out, and he pointed a trembling finger towards the flames.
That's my suit, he roared. My suit! The one you were supposed to send to the cleaners.
What? Exclaimed Mr. Brown. Everyone turned to look at Paddington. Paddington was as surprised as the others. It was the first he had heard of Mr. Curry's suit.
I found it on the doorstep, he said. I thought it had been put out for the rummage sale.
The rummage sale?
cried Mr. Curry, almost beside himself with rage.
Rummage sale, my best suit. I'll.
Mr. Curry was spluttering so much he couldn't think of anything to say, but Mrs. Bird could.
To start with, she said, it wasn't your best suit. It's been sent to cleaners at least 6 times to my knowledge, and I'm quite sure Paddington didn't know it was yours. In any case, she finished triumphantly, who was it insisted it should go on the bonfire in the first place?
Mr. Brown tried hard not to laugh, and then he caught Mr. Gruber's eye looking at him over the top of his handkerchief. "You did, you know," he spluttered. "You said put it on the bonfire, and Paddington tried to stop you." Mr. Curry struggled hard for a moment as he looked from one to the other, but he knew when he was beaten. He gave one final glare all around the party and then stalked off into the night. A moment later, the sound of a front door being slammed echoed around the houses.
"Well," chuckled Mr. Gruber, "I must say that when young Mr. Brown's around, there's never a dull moment."
He felt underneath his chair and brought out a cardboard box.
"Now I vote we get on with the display, and in case we run out of fireworks, I have brought a few more along."
"You know, it's funny you should say that," said Mr. Brown, feeling under his chair, "but I have some as well." Afterwards, everyone in the neighbourhood voted it was the best firework display they'd seen for many a year. Quite a number of people turned up to watch, and even Mr. Curry was seen peeping out from behind his curtains on several occasions. And as Paddington lifted a tired paw and waved the last sparkler in the air to spell out the words, "The End," everyone agreed they had never seen such a successful bonfire before, or such a well-dressed guy.